Welcome back, everyone. So today we're supposed to talk about justice, but I feel reluctant to go too deeply into it because I feel like this isn't kindergarten and the lecture's pretty simple and straightforward, so everyone should read it themselves instead of me kind of just reading it to you all. You're supposed to read the lecture ahead of time so that then you can ask questions. But I know that 99% of the time that doesn't happen, so. It's easy to get distracted in the world, right? When so much is going on. There are bills to pay and there's just so many things to do, right? Like you have to go shopping, you have to do laundry. It's like you almost need a secretary just to live that part of your life for you, just so you can still go to work and try to meditate and sleep and do all the other things that you need to do, right? So it's easy to get so distracted. But it's so important to remember right? Like how evanescent those things are. Like I can't stress it enough. I feel like I can't communicate it properly. The idea that you could spend your whole life getting caught up in the day-to-day activities, that when you finally die, you realize that you never did the things that really mattered to you. And I'm not even talking about the spiritual path, right? This is like something that plagues everyone, even from doing the things that are meaningful in a more worldly sense. People spend so much time just running around back and forth doing things that really don't matter as much, right? Like there are things you can do to simplify your life. There are things you can do to simplify your life that you don't want to do. Forms of entertainment that you could reduce from your life so that you could have more meaningful reactions, meaningful interactions with the people that you love, the people that are close to you, and build something strong, build something that actually nourishes you. This kind of goes into justice a little bit. There's an important point made in the lecture where it talks about how if you have a kid and you're raising a kid and all these guardians for the child, right, like the grandchildren or the grandparents and the parents and the aunts and the uncles, and everyone's arguing over whether or not the child should pursue music. And some people think the child should take up and learn an instrument, and some people think he or she shouldn't. And they all have different reasons for why the child should do this or do that. And this is like a really important thing that's mentioned in the lecture because it really hones in on a simple point, which I don't think is explicitly stated in the lecture, but which is that in order to effectively live a just life, you have to first live a wise life, right? Like justice, like wisdom depends on justice in that sense. And to Plato, justice was the highest virtue, right? To Plato, justice was the virtue that all the other ones kind of depended upon for the human. It was the most important virtue. It's the reason why he's always searching for it in his writings, right? That Socrates is always searching for what true justice is. So wisdom is knowledge of what brings you closer to the good, right? Wisdom is knowledge of what's good for you. So for example, you can't be wise because you know how to ride a bike, right? You can have knowledge of how to ride a bike, but that knowledge doesn't make you wise. And if someone could say that they knew how to ride a bike in a way that was wise, you would have to think that something about how that person was riding their bike was good for their soul. Like immediately it makes you wonder, like, what is it that they know about riding bikes that enriches them? Because surely that's what you mean when you say that they ride a bike in a wise way, right? So it's a silly example, but it's true. So you have to try to live your life in a way that's wise. You have to start making decisions and contemplations. And really, Ramos said something once that really sticks with me. He says, the spiritual path is about learning how to say no. Because there are so many things that are coming into our life. If we can just say no to all the bad things, then usually we'll be in a pretty great spot. And it doesn't mean that we have to be unhappy. It means the opposite. I find it interesting that there's a biography of Proclus. And in the biography of Proclus by one of his students, the author makes it like his primary focus, his primary point in the biography to stress the fact that Proclus was the happiest man alive. He says it in the opening of the book, he says it in the closing of the book. The very essence of the biography is that this writer is trying to impress the idea upon the reader that Proclus was the happiest man alive. And it was because of his theurgy. So it's important to remember that. And entertainment is such a shallow form of happiness. It's what Plato would call pastry making. It's like what Plato would call pastry making in the Gorgias. That entertainment seems good on the outside, but it lacks any substance. And so without thinking, without contemplating, and without being firm and disciplined with ourselves, it's easy to fall into the trap of moving in the direction of entertainment. And before you realize it, you're completely malnourished of the things that nourish the soul. So it's important. It can be so easy to be distracted in life. But life is uncompromising. The universe is uncompromising. You can't argue with the results of your life by saying, well, I was really busy. Right? The universe is uncompromising. If I hold something up and I let it go, it's going to fall, right? Like, the universe is what it is. You determine how you react to those things. Your astrology chart, your field of activity, it is what it is. You decide the choices you make within that field of activity. So justice is knowledge of what's good for you and what's bad for you, right? In a sense, that's what wisdom is. And justice is moving in the direction of those things which are good for you and transforming the things that are bad for you into things that are good for you and transforming bad things into good things and bringing good things closer to the good itself, right? That's what justice is. And in all cases, when one thing is greater or superior to another thing, the justice of the greater thing is more important than the justice of the inferior thing. So the simplest analogy is the one which is made in the lecture, that sometimes there are things which are good for the body and bad for the soul, and things which are bad for the body and good for the soul. And in all such cases, then, it's better to move towards the things which are good for the soul and bad for the body. Now, ultimately, we want to live a balanced life, right? And that's why we don't fast every single day until we finally die. But you could argue that death isn't very good for the soul because incarnation is natural to the soul. And so if the soul is incarnating, it makes sense to try to make that incarnation as successful as possible. But not to the degree that it detriments the essence of the soul itself. So justice is one of the last lectures. The lecture on justice is one of the last lectures in the ethics portion of the preliminary cycle. It's one of the most important lectures. It's very simple. A lot of these ethics lectures are very simple and short and straightforward, but full of substance and meaning. Plato spent his entire life talking about justice. He would spend years simply writing one small dialogue, and he spent his entire life writing dialogue after dialogue, creating a corpus this large. And in many cases, always seeking what is justice and what is wisdom, right? And philosophy is called the love of wisdom. And truly, if you love wisdom, then you're going to act accordingly. And acting in accordance with wisdom is what justice is. So I want everyone to try to be a little just remember this a little bit more, right? Like the spiritual path could be called the path of remembrance. And this lecture actually touches briefly on anamnesis, the doctrine of remembrance, when it talks about how justice is native to the soul. And again, the lecture kind of just passes on right by it. It's mentioned in the beginning, but this is a doctrine which is important to Plato and a doctrine which is important to us. But for the sake of brevity and clarity, the lecture touches on a lot of really important, deep points very briefly and just moves through them. And that's why it's important to really read these things with meaning and understanding. But the doctrine of anamnesis, like it talks about how a child, when it's born, understands justice natively. But because the child perceives justice through such a small lens of its personal experience, it's not guided by wisdom, but it still understands the fundamental principle of justice, which is that you should move towards the things which are good for you and away from the things that are bad for you. Right? And this is something that all children know. They never have to be taught it, which means that the soul understands justice natively within itself. And so when we learn about justice, we're really remembering that foreknowledge, right? That the soul already has everything in it that it could ever learn, that it ever needs to know. So this is what's touched on, and this is the doctrine of anamnesis. And because the child is perceiving everything through such a small lens, it's making improper decisions, right? And this is like kind of a principle that's talked about in Iamblichean theurgy, when Iamblichus teaches that the world soul, even though it's soul, it's composed of soul just as we are, isn't prone to the same mistakes that we are because it has an image of the whole, right? The world soul has an image of the greater good that our personal souls inherently or immediately lack. And so it can be very easy for us when we're looking through these small bodies and through these individual perspectives to think we know what's, to move in a direction or think we know what's best for us and to make arguments and disagreements and fight with people over silly things and trivial things and to make bad decisions for ourselves that lead us in a way that takes us further from the good, right? Because we think we know what's good for us when we don't, in that sense. And so theurgy is about trying to expand the soul's awareness more and more so that it encompasses greater and greater things. And the analogy that Iamblichus uses is that of dancing, saying that when you're dancing, there are parts of the body that will be strained for the sake of other parts. And so that strained part might bemoan its case and say, oh, I'm in pain, I'm suffering, this is bad. But in reality, it's necessary for the good of the whole. So this is the enlightened perspective that we have to move towards. Compassion is the mode in which we do that. I've said it before, and it's something I used to stress a lot, is that you have to try, in the spiritual path in your life, you have to try to embody a sense of saintliness, right? It's important to consecrate your own motive, right? This is a key phrase, consecration of motive. Remind yourself of that throughout the day. Consecration of motive, consecration of motive. This means that you have to consecrate your ideas, your intent. It's important when you practice too. It's very simple to sit and meditate and meditate simply because you want to feel good or because you want to get it out of the way or because you don't want to feel guilty. And so you'll achieve those things, but you won't achieve the things beyond them. If you meditate so that you don't feel guilty, then when you're done meditating, you won't feel guilty anymore. And if you meditate so that you can feel good, then when you get done meditating, you'll feel good. You feel a little blissful, you have some good energy. Right? But these aren't the reasons why we're meditating. It's important to establish a clear intent when you practice. That when you sit down to meditate, why are you meditating? And you have to constantly try to refine that motivation and consecrate it ever closer to the good. So this is important. And when you sit down to meditate, you really have to contemplate why you're meditating, who you are, how do you identify yourself, right? And in what direction are you moving? When you sit down to meditate, think, who am I? Who is Gigi? Who is Eric? Like, who are these people? Who am I? And why am I doing this, right? And set clear motive. This is very difficult early on. And if you think it's easy, then you're probably just not very good at introspection. It's difficult early on, but it's necessary, right? Because again, like I said, the universe is uncompromising. You can make all the compromises you want, but at the end of the day, you're not held to your own standards. You're held to the standards of the universe that you live within. So it's important to make sure that your path is right and true. So consecration of motive is very important, and it should suffuse every part of your life so that everything that you do has a kind of consecration of motive. And you have to kind of bring down into yourself and ground. You have to like grab by the heels and pull down this image of saintliness, this feeling of grace that you can pull into yourself if you manage to maintain a kind of purity throughout the day. So it's important, right? Because if you identify yourself as a normal person, then it's natural to act like a normal person. If you identify yourself as an angry person, then it's natural in an angry way. What's important to do is not identify yourself just as like a theurgist, because it might be hard for you to grasp onto that notion. Or identify yourself as a meditator, because plenty of people meditate. You have to cut through those things and get to the essence. Identify yourself as a saint, right? Identify yourself as a holy man or as a holy woman. Now, all of a sudden, that seems more intimidating because you're looking at the situation honestly. So this is very important. And when you do your purification in the morning, you should wake up, you should do your purification and chant your Kyrie eleison and try to become more attuned to God and ask God to begin suffusing your life. And make a declaration of intent that you're going to try to make your life more in tune with the good, so that your life becomes a living ritual that embodies divine activity, right? So that God can begin coming into your life. So this is very important. And any time throughout the day that you feel like you're starting to stray from that purity, and anytime you do something physically that would obscure that purity, like going to the bathroom, anytime you do something emotionally that would obscure that purity, like losing control of yourself, anything you do, something mentally that would obscure that purity, like thinking negative thoughts, then you have to bring yourself back and do your purifications, do your Kyrie eleisons, and try to bring that sacredness back into your life. You know, if you have an object that you consider sacred, like some relics, some solidified mercury, an image of a deity, the altar itself, whatever it is, you treat it with a kind of sanctity. If you have a sacred scripture, for example, you don't just throw it off to the side and let it become dirty. You would feel terrible if you did that. I hope you would. You keep it on the altar and you keep it with a kind of sanctity. You need to develop that same sense about yourself. You need to develop that same idea about yourself. Because these things you treat them sacred because they're aligned with God. They're just. And as such, they serve as receptacles for divine energy of a certain kind, right? So you need to try to embody that in yourself and learn to see yourself as a sacred object. And so that's why you're doing your purifications, because you are sacred. And if something obscures that, right? Like if an animal jumps on your altar and does something like spits a hairball on your altar, you would be horrified and you would clean it off right away. Well, you should be sacred as well. You should be sanctified and consecrated as well. So if you do something that obscures that purity on a physical, emotional, or mental level, then you have to clean it off. You have to purify yourself of it. And the magic of water is a great way to do that, by taking water and chanting some mantras over it and washing yourself and chanting your mantras as you do it, making sure that you're doing it in a mental and emotional and in a physical way, that you're incorporating your visualization, that you're remaining firm in your intent, right? And begin to bring a quality of purity into your life so that you feel like you're a moving relic. You feel like you're a moving spiritual object. Then all of a sudden it will become impossible for you to lose your temper at someone, because you'll be desecrating the sacred object that you're working so hard on, right? So that you can begin orchestrating your person into something that's a befitting receptacle, right? Like it's the crater and the cantharos. Like you have to take this thing, the cantharos, and if it's misshapen, if it's got a crack in it, if it's a little dirty, if it's on its side, through the process of catharsis, which occurs on many different levels. Right? The catharsis at the highest level is like a Gnostic catharsis. At a basic level, it's controlling your desires and taming your passions. And after that, the level above that is the energetic catharsis, which many people in school know all too well about. And there are these grades of catharsis that you go through of purification. And you have to take that misshapen kantharos and you have to fix it and iron it out and make it into a fitting receptacle so that the light of God, which is always pouring down, can begin to fill it in a balanced and whole way. Right? Your life itself is a very real thing. The energies of your life are very real. You can't see them, you can't touch them. It's incorporeal, but it's real. And we should all know that the things which are incorporeal are more real and more permanent than the things which aren't. Right? Your life is a very real thing, and you need to begin to bring down into your soul and into your life, which is the expression of your soul's energies, the orbit of your soul. You have to begin organizing it in such a way that it can begin to imitate divinity, so that divinity can begin to descend down into it. So constantly remain pure. At least do one prayer cycle a day. You're all doing the preliminary cycle, which is a prayer cycle. So if you can do your purifications and you can do a preliminary cycle in the morning, and you can maintain that purity throughout the day, and then do a preliminary cycle at night, and do your purifications before you go to sleep, you'll be doing so well. But it's important to keep and maintain that purity throughout the day. After just a short while, you begin to get a very distinct feeling of what it's like to maintain a purity. And as soon as it begins to fade away, you'll miss it and you'll notice it and you'll feel it and you'll want to get it back. So think about these things. Think about the path of remembrance. Think about the importance of the spiritual path, right? There's nothing that can offset the weight of the spiritual path. Right? Because you have something eternal on one side and something temporal on the other. That's not to say to renounce everything temporal, because those things have a purpose and a meaning. And that's an entirely different lecture for another time. The temporal things have plenty of necessity, right? Otherwise, none of us would be here right now. We'd all just be starving ourselves to death in a cave. We'd be dead in a week. And then we'd be incarnating right back again. So, but it's important to just make sure that you balance your motive and your intention. That you keep the spiritual path at the forefront, right? So that it's not the first priority. The spiritual path shouldn't be your first priority. It should be who you are, right? It doesn't belong in the stack of priorities. It belongs within every priority as the underlying essence of who you are, that you become the spiritual path itself. So let's all chant the opening prayer together and we'll close for the night. Makad hostes iureman teletas de oneros biodan agistue kai yasue taipsukan. Thank you, everyone, and God bless. Be victorious.